Beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean, somewhere between memory and myth, lies a civilization that has captivated human imagination for over 2 millennia. A place of impossible wonders, advanced technology, and profound wisdom. A society that rose to heights we can barely comprehend, only to vanish in a single catastrophic day and night. This is the story of Atlantis, not as legend, but as history. This is the story of how they lived, how they loved, how they built an empire that touched the stars, and how it all came crashing down into the depths of the sea. For centuries, scholars dismissed Atlantis as mere allegory, a philosophical tale invented by Plato to illustrate his ideas about the perfect state. But what if they were wrong? What if the ancient Greek philosopher was recording actual history, passed down through Egyptian priests who preserved the memory of this lost world? What if, hidden in archaeological anomalies, ancient texts, and the collective unconscious of humanity, there exists evidence of a civilization that predated all others, a civilization called Atlantis? Today, we embark on a journey through time, reconstructing the daily life of the Atlanteans from fragments of myth, controversial archaeological findings, and the persistent whispers of ancient memory. We will walk their streets, enter their homes, witness their rituals, and understand their society. We will see how ordinary Atlanteans lived their lives in the shadow of crystal towers and beneath skies filled with flying vessels. And we will bear witness to the final hours of the greatest civilization the world has ever known. This is not the Atlantis of fantasy. This is Atlantis as it was, a living, breathing society of real people with hopes, fears, ambitions, and flaws. This is daily life in ancient Atlantis. Chapter 1. The dawn of Atlantis long before the pyramids rose from the sands of Egypt, before the first cities of Mesopotamia were built, before humanity learned to write or forge bronze, there was Atlantis. According to the timeline preserved in Plato's dialogues, Atlantis flourished approximately 11,600 years ago, during a period geologists call the Younger Dryas, a time of dramatic climate change and global upheaval. The origins of Atlantis are shrouded in the mists of deep time, but Atlantean creation myths, allegedly preserved in fragments of pre-Columbian texts and mysterious inscriptions found in underwater structures off the coast of Bimini, tell a remarkable story. They speak of a great migration, of people fleeing a cataclysm in an even older homeland, arriving at a large island in the Atlantic Ocean, an island that would become the heart of their empire. The island itself was a geological marvel. Roughly the size of Libya and Asia Minor combined, according to Plato's account, it sat upon a volcanic hotspot, giving it rich, fertile soil and natural hot springs that the Atlanteans would later harness for their advanced heating systems. The island was ringed by mountains that protected a vast central plain, and at its heart stood a modest hill where the first settlers established their capital city. But the Atlantis we know, the Atlantis of legend, did not emerge overnight. It took thousands of years for this island civilization to develop the characteristics that would make it legendary. The early Atlanteans were not so different from other Neolithic peoples. They farmed, they fished, they built simple stone structures, and they worshipped the forces of nature they could not understand. What set them apart was their location. The island of Atlantis sat at the crossroads of ocean currents and wind patterns that made it a natural hub for maritime trade. As the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, Atlantis found itself perfectly positioned to become a bridge between continents. Traders from Africa, Europe, and the Americas, yes, the Americas, for the Atlanteans had discovered these lands millennia before Columbus, all passed through Atlantean ports, bringing with them knowledge, technology, and culture. It was this unique position, this confluence of peoples and ideas, that sparked what historians of the lost civilization call the Atlantean Enlightenment, a period of rapid technological and cultural advancement that began around 13,000 years ago and continued for over a millennium. During this time, the Atlanteans made breakthrough after breakthrough. They developed a sophisticated understanding of mathematics and astronomy. They learned to work with metals in ways that wouldn't be rediscovered for thousands of years. They built ships that could cross oceans. And most remarkably, they discovered the properties of certain crystals that could store and transmit energy, a technology that would become the foundation of their entire civilization. The capital city, which the Atlanteans called Poseidonis after their patron god Poseidon, grew from a simple hilltop settlement into a marvel of ancient engineering. According to detailed descriptions preserved in Plato's account, the city was built in a series of concentric rings, alternating rings of land and water, connected by bridges and tunnels. The outermost ring was 3 stads wide, approximately 600 meters, and each successive ring grew smaller as they approached the central island where the royal palace and the great temple of Poseidon stood. But these weren't mere decorative canals. The rings served multiple purposes in Atlantean society. They were defensive fortifications, making the city nearly impregnable to attack. They were transportation networks, with boats carrying goods and people throughout the city. They were part of an advanced hydraulic system that controlled flooding and provided fresh water to every district. And they were symbolic, representing the Atlantean cosmological view of the universe as a series of nested spheres, each containing the next, with the divine at the center. The construction of these rings was itself a feat of engineering that challenges our understanding of ancient capabilities. The Atlanteans quarried stone from beneath the central island, creating vast underground chambers that would later serve as storage facilities, workshops, and sacred spaces. They lined the canals with precisely cut stone blocks, some weighing many tons, fitted together so perfectly that no mortar was needed. They built bridges of bronze and covered them with silver and gold, creating a city that gleamed in the sunlight like a jewel set in the ocean. As Poseidonis grew, so did the Atlantean Empire. The Atlanteans were master sailors, and their ships, powered by a combination of sails, oars, and, according to some accounts, crystal-based propulsion systems, ranged far and wide across the ancient world. They established colonies and trading posts on the coasts of Africa, Europe, and the Americas. They brought back exotic goods, rare materials, and most importantly, knowledge. This was the golden age of Atlantis, a time when the empire stretched across the known world, when Atlantean ships dominated the seas, and when the capital city grew into a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people, an unthinkable population for a city in the Stone Age, yet one that the Atlanteans sustained through advanced agriculture, aquaculture, and trade networks that spanned continents. But with growth came complexity, and with complexity came the need for organization. The simple tribal structures of early Atlantis gave way to a sophisticated hierarchical society, one that would shape every aspect of daily life for the Atlantean people. Chapter 2. The social hierarchy. To understand daily life in Atlantis, one must first understand the rigid social structure that governed every interaction, every opportunity, every aspect of an Atlantean's existence. Atlantean society was divided into 7 distinct classes, each with its own rights, responsibilities, and restrictions. This system, known as the 7 circles in reference to the concentric rings of the capital city, was believed to be divinely ordained, a reflection of cosmic order imposed upon human society. At the apex of Atlantean society stood the royal family, descendants of Poseidon himself according to Atlantean mythology. The king, called the Atlas, named after the first king of Atlantis, was not merely a political leader but a living god, a bridge between the mortal and divine realms. The Atlas wore a crown of orichalcum, a mysterious metal unique to Atlantis that was said to be second only to gold in value. This metal, described as having a reddish-golden hue and unusual properties, has never been definitively identified by modern science, leading to speculation that it was either a copper alloy lost to history or something more exotic, perhaps a metal that no longer exists in nature. The Atlas lived in the central palace, a structure so vast and ornate that ancient accounts struggle to describe it adequately. The palace complex covered the entire central island of Poseidonis, an area of approximately 5 stads in diameter, nearly a kilometer across. Its walls were covered in orichalcum, which was said to glow with an inner fire, especially at sunset. The palace contained hundreds of rooms, including the famous Hall of Judgment where the Atlas held court, the Chamber of Crystals where the most powerful energy crystals were kept, and the Royal Archives, which contained the accumulated knowledge of Atlantean civilization written on sheets of a material described as being like metal but flexible, possibly an early form of metal foil or something more advanced. The royal family numbered in the hundreds, as the Atlas traditionally took multiple wives to ensure succession, and all his children, legitimate and otherwise, were considered part of the royal bloodline. These princes and princesses lived lives of unimaginable luxury, but they also bore heavy responsibilities. They were expected to master all forms of knowledge, science, philosophy, military strategy, and the mystical arts. They served as governors of Atlantean colonies, commanders of fleets and armies, and high priests in the temples. Below the royal family stood the priest-scientists, the second circle of Atlantean society. These were the individuals who maintained and advanced Atlantean technology, who communed with the gods in the temples, and who educated the elite. The priest-scientists wore robes of deep blue, the color of the ocean depths, and they shaved their heads as a sign of their devotion to pure knowledge, unmarred by vanity. The priest-scientists were divided into various orders, each specializing in different fields. The crystal masters understood the properties of the great crystals that powered Atlantean civilization. The star readers studied the heavens and maintained the complex calendar system that governed Atlantean life. The healers combined herbal knowledge with crystal therapy and what they called energy manipulation to treat diseases. The architects designed the great buildings and engineered the infrastructure that made Atlantean cities function. And the historians preserved the records and memories of the civilization, ensuring that knowledge was passed down through generations. To become a priest-scientist required decades of study. Candidates, usually drawn from the noble class but occasionally from exceptional commoners, entered the temples as children and spent their entire youth in rigorous education. They learned mathematics, astronomy, geometry, medicine, metallurgy, and the secret knowledge of crystal technology. They studied ancient texts and conducted experiments. They meditated and performed rituals designed to expand their consciousness. Only after passing a series of grueling tests, usually in their 30th year, were they initiated into the full mysteries and allowed to wear the blue robes. The third circle consisted of the nobles, the aristocratic class that owned most of the land and controlled much of the wealth. Nobles lived in grand villas in the outer rings of Poseidonis or on estates in the countryside. They wore elaborate clothing made from fine linen and silk. Yes, silk, which the Atlanteans imported from distant lands or produced themselves from a native species of moth. Noble men typically wore knee-length tunics with intricate embroidery, while noble women wore long, flowing dresses with multiple layers, often leaving their breasts bare in the Atlantean fashion, which saw the female form as sacred and beautiful rather than shameful. Nobles were expected to serve the state in various capacities. Young noble men underwent military training and served in the Atlantean army or navy for at least 10 years. Noble women often became priestesses, healers, or administrators. The most talented might rise to become priest-scientists themselves. Nobles also had the responsibility of patronizing the arts, funding public works, and maintaining the temples in their districts. The fourth circle was the merchant class, the economic engine of Atlantean society. These were the traders, ship owners, workshop masters, and financiers who kept goods and wealth flowing through the empire. Merchants occupied an interesting position in Atlantean society. They were wealthy, often wealthier than many nobles, but they lacked the social prestige and political power of the upper classes. They could not hold high government office, could not become priest-scientists, and were restricted in what they could wear and how they could display their wealth. Yet merchants were essential to Atlantean prosperity, and they knew it. They formed powerful guilds that negotiated with the government and sometimes wielded considerable influence behind the scenes. The Merchant Guild of Poseidonis, for instance, effectively controlled the city's food supply and could bring the capital to its knees if their demands were not met. Wise atlases understood the need to keep the merchants satisfied, even if they could not be allowed to rise too high. Merchants lived well, in comfortable homes in the commercial districts of Atlantean cities. They ate fine food, wore good clothing, though not as elaborate as the nobles, and could afford slaves and servants. Their children received good educations, and occasionally, through marriage or exceptional service to the state, a merchant family might be elevated to the nobility. The fifth circle comprised the artisans, the skilled workers who created the goods that made Atlantean civilization function. This class included metalworkers, potters, weavers, jewelers, shipwrights, stonemasons, and countless other specialized craftspeople. Artisans were organized into guilds that controlled training, maintained quality standards, and protected their members' interests. An artisan's life was one of hard work but also pride and relative security. A skilled craftsperson could make a comfortable living, own a modest home, and pass their trade down to their children. The best artisans, those whose work was truly exceptional, might even attract the attention of noble patrons or the royal family itself, leading to commissions that could make them wealthy and respected. Artisans typically lived in the middle rings of Poseidonis or in the artisan quarters of other cities. Their homes were small but well built, usually consisting of a workshop on the ground floor and living quarters above. They wore simple tunics of undyed linen or wool, though they might add a colored sash or belt to indicate their guild affiliation. Their diet was plain but adequate: bread, vegetables, fish, and occasionally meat on festival days. The sixth circle was the largest: the laborers, the common people who performed the unskilled or semi-skilled work that kept society running. These were the farmers who worked the fields, the fishermen who brought in the daily catch, the dock workers who loaded and unloaded ships, the servants who maintained noble households, the street cleaners, the water carriers, and countless others whose labor was essential but unremarkable. Laborers lived simple lives in small homes or apartments in the outer rings of cities or in villages throughout the Atlantean territories. Their homes were basic, usually just 1 or 2 rooms with earthen floors, simple furniture, and few possessions. They wore rough tunics and went barefoot or wore simple sandals. Their diet consisted mainly of bread, porridge, vegetables, and fish, with meat being a rare luxury. Yet even laborers in Atlantis lived better than common people in most other ancient civilizations. Atlantean law guaranteed certain basic rights to all citizens, including laborers. They could not be killed or maimed by their superiors without cause. They had the right to appeal to the courts if they were treated unjustly. They received a basic education in reading, writing, and arithmetic, and they were entitled to a share of grain from the public granaries during times of famine. At the bottom of the social hierarchy, outside the 7 circles entirely, were the slaves. Slavery in Atlantis was complex and not quite like slavery in later civilizations. Atlantean slaves were primarily prisoners of war, criminals, or people who had sold themselves into slavery to pay debts. They were not considered property in the absolute sense. They had certain legal protections, and their children were not automatically slaves. However, their lives were hard, and they had no freedom. Slaves performed the most difficult and dangerous work: mining, quarrying, rowing in the galleys, and working in the fields under the hot sun. They lived in barracks or slave quarters, wore simple tunics marked with their owner's symbol, and were fed just enough to keep them working. Some slaves, particularly those with valuable skills or those who served in wealthy households, lived relatively comfortable lives and might even earn their freedom eventually. But for most, slavery was a harsh existence with little hope of escape. This social hierarchy was not merely a matter of wealth or power. It was woven into the very fabric of Atlantean life. Where you lived, what you wore, what you ate, whom you could marry, what education you received, what work you could do, all of this was determined by your position in the 7 circles. And yet, the system was not entirely rigid. Exceptional individuals could rise through the ranks through military service, intellectual achievement, or extraordinary skill. And the Atlanteans believed that the soul reincarnated, so a slave in this life might be born a noble in the next if they lived virtuously. This belief in reincarnation and cosmic justice helped maintain social stability, even as it justified inequality. The Atlanteans saw their social hierarchy not as oppression, but as natural order, a reflection of spiritual development. Those at the top had earned their position through many lifetimes of growth, while those at the bottom were young souls still learning the lessons of existence. Chapter 3. The City of Rings. To truly understand daily life in Atlantis, we must walk the streets of Poseidonis, the capital city, the jewel of the empire, the place where all the wonders and contradictions of Atlantean civilization came together in a dazzling display of human achievement. Imagine approaching Poseidonis from the sea, as countless traders, diplomats, and travelers did over the centuries. The first thing you would see, rising from the horizon, would be the Great Lighthouse, a tower of white marble and orichalcum that stood at the entrance to the harbor, rising perhaps 150 meters into the sky. At its top burned a flame that never went out, fed by natural gas piped up from underground and intensified by a system of mirrors and crystals that made it visible for hundreds of kilometers on a clear night. As your ship drew closer, the full majesty of the city would reveal itself. The outer wall, which encircled the entire city at a distance of 50 stads from the center, was a massive fortification of stone covered in brass that gleamed in the sunlight. This wall was not merely defensive, it was a statement of power, a declaration that Atlantis was impregnable, eternal, invincible. Passing through the Great Sea Gate, your ship would enter the outermost ring canal, a waterway 3 stads wide and deep enough to accommodate the largest vessels. This canal was always busy, crowded with ships from across the known world. Egyptian vessels with their distinctive square sails, Phoenician traders with holds full of purple dye and cedar wood, strange ships from the far west, from the lands we now call the Americas, carrying jade, obsidian, and exotic feathers. And of course, Atlantean ships, sleek, fast vessels with hulls of treated wood that resisted rot and sails of a material that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. The outermost ring of land was the commercial district, and it was a riot of activity and noise. Warehouses lined the waterfront, their doors open to reveal goods from across the world, spices from the east, furs from the north, gold from Africa, copper from distant mines. Cranes powered by a system of counterweights, and some say crystal energy, lifted heavy cargo from ships to docks. Dock workers, their skin bronzed by the sun and their muscles hardened by labor, shouted and cursed as they worked. Merchants haggled in a dozen languages. Street vendors sold food and drink to the crowds. Pickpockets and prostitutes plied their trades in the shadows. The buildings in the outer ring were functional rather than beautiful, mostly warehouses, workshops, taverns, and the modest homes of laborers and artisans. They were built of stone and brick, usually 2 or 3 stories tall, with flat roofs where families would sleep on hot summer nights. The streets were paved with stone and had drainage channels running down the center, part of the sophisticated sewer system that kept Atlantean cities remarkably clean by ancient standards. Moving inward, crossing one of the great bridges that span the canals, you would enter the second ring of land, the artisan quarter. Here, the character of the city changed. The buildings were better maintained, the streets cleaner, the crowds more orderly. This was where the skilled craftspeople of Atlantis lived and worked, and their pride in their craft was evident everywhere. The artisan quarter was organized by trade. There was the street of metalworkers, where the constant sound of hammering rang out from dawn to dusk, and the air smelled of coal smoke and hot metal. The potter's district, where thousands of vessels were produced each day, from simple cooking pots to elaborate ceremonial urns decorated with scenes from Atlantean mythology. The weaver's quarter, where the clacking of looms created a constant rhythm, and brightly colored fabrics hung from windows to dry. The jeweler's row, where artisans worked with gold, silver, and precious stones, creating the ornaments that adorned the wealthy. Each guild had its own hall, a building that served as meeting place, training center, and temple to the patron god of that craft. The guild hall of the metalworkers, for instance, was dedicated to Hephaestus, the god of the forge, and contained a sacred flame that had burned continuously for over 1,000 years, tended by apprentices who considered it a great honor. The artisan quarter was also home to the Great Market, a vast open square where goods were bought and sold every day except during religious festivals. The market was divided into sections, one for food, one for cloth and clothing, one for tools and household goods, one for luxury items. Prices were regulated by the merchant guild and the government to prevent exploitation, and inspectors moved through the market constantly, checking weights and measures and the quality of goods. In the center of the market stood the Fountain of Abundance, a magnificent structure of marble and bronze that featured statues of the gods pouring water from urns. This was not merely decorative. The fountain was part of the city's water system, providing fresh water to the market district. The water came from springs in the mountains, carried to the city by a system of aqueducts and underground pipes, then distributed throughout the city by a network of channels and fountains. Every district had its public fountains where people could draw water for free, one of the services the government provided to all citizens. Crossing another bridge, you would enter the third ring of land, the residential district of the merchant class and minor nobles. Here, the buildings were more elegant, built of finer stone and decorated with columns, friezes, and painted plaster. The homes were larger, often built around central courtyards with gardens and fountains. The streets were wider and lined with trees, palms, olives, and a species of flowering tree unique to Atlantis that produced fragrant white blossoms in the spring. This district was quieter than the outer rings, more refined. Children of wealthy families played in the streets under the watchful eyes of slaves and servants. Litters carried noble ladies to visit friends or to the temples. Philosophers and teachers walked with their students, engaged in deep discussions. Small shops sold luxury goods, fine wines, imported delicacies, books. Yes, books, for the Atlanteans had developed a form of paper made from a native plant, musical instruments, and works of art. The third ring was also home to many of the city's temples. Atlantean religion was polytheistic, with a pantheon of gods headed by Poseidon, the patron deity of Atlantis. Each god had multiple temples throughout the city, but the third ring contained some of the most important. The Temple of Cleito, named after the mortal woman who became Poseidon's wife and the mother of Atlas, was a place where women came to pray for fertility and safe childbirth. The Temple of Atlas, dedicated to the first king, was where oaths were sworn and contracts sealed. Temple of the Moon Goddess, whose name has been lost to time, was where the mysteries of death and rebirth were celebrated. These temples were not merely places of worship. They were community centers, schools, hospitals, and banks. The temples owned vast amounts of land and wealth, which they used to fund public services. They ran schools where children learned to read and write. They operated hospitals where the sick could receive treatment from priest healers. They provided loans to merchants and farmers. And they organized the great festivals that punctuated the Atlantean year, bringing the entire community together in celebration and worship. Moving inward again, you would cross into the fourth ring of land, the noble district. Here, the grandeur of Atlantis became truly apparent. The homes were not merely houses, but palaces in miniature, each trying to outdo the others in magnificence. They were built of the finest marble, with columns of porphyry and granite, with doors of bronze and windows of a transparent material that might have been glass or crystal. The walls were covered in frescoes depicting scenes from mythology, history, and daily life, hunting scenes, naval battles, religious ceremonies, and pastoral landscapes. These noble villas were surrounded by extensive gardens, carefully designed landscapes that combined beauty with utility. There were ornamental gardens with exotic flowers and sculpted hedges. There were orchards producing fruits, figs, pomegranates, apples, and citrus fruits. There were vegetable gardens tended by slaves, and there were sacred groves, small wooded areas dedicated to various gods, where the family could perform private rituals. The noble district was also home to the great public buildings of Atlantis. The Library of Poseidonus, a vast structure containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls and tablets, was the repository of all Atlantean knowledge. Scholars from across the empire came here to study, and the library's collection included not only Atlantean works, but texts from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other civilizations, translated into the Atlantean language by teams of scribes. The gymnasium was where young nobles trained their bodies as well as their minds. It was a large complex including exercise grounds, baths, swimming pools, and lecture halls. Young men would spend hours each day here, wrestling, running, throwing the discus and javelin, and practicing with weapons, all under the supervision of trainers who were often retired military officers. The Theater of Poseidonus could seat 20,000 people and was the venue for dramatic performances, musical concerts, and public assemblies. The Atlanteans had a rich dramatic tradition, with plays that ranged from comedies mocking the foibles of daily life to tragedies exploring the relationship between humans and gods. The theater was built into a hillside, with excellent acoustics that allowed even those in the highest seats to hear every word. The fifth ring of land was restricted. This was where the priest-scientists lived and worked, in a complex of temples, laboratories, and living quarters. Access was controlled, and ordinary citizens could only enter on specific festival days or if they had business with the priests. This was where the great crystals were studied and maintained, where astronomical observations were made from tall towers, where the secrets of Atlantean technology were guarded and advanced. The buildings in the priest district were different from those in other parts of the city, more austere, more focused on function than display. The laboratories were filled with strange apparatus, glass vessels for chemical experiments, metal instruments for precise measurements, and of course, crystals of various sizes and types, each with its own properties and uses. The great observatory was the tallest struct.